Taxi Driver was released in 1976 and was directed by Martin Scorsese. The film is about a guy who just kind of drives a taxi and kind of looks for a purpose in this huge, messed up, dirty city. I know that sounds pretty vague, but that's because this movie doesn't really have a traditional plot structure. It's much less about A leads to B, which leads to C, which leads to D, which finally leads to Z, and it's more about A leads to B, and it leads to C, and it leads to D, but actually, D never led to anywhere, so now we're back at A, which leads to B, leads to C, and then it leads to O, but actually, O never went anywhere either. So now we're back at A, which leads to B, which leads to C, which leads to D, but oh no, we have to skip a couple letters so that we can get to Z. Does that make sense? No? Let me explain. The movie has a structure where you're kind of inside Travis Bickle's mind, not just from the atmosphere and his environment, but also through the fact that he's just kind of wandering the streets pretty much for the entire movie. Like, even when he's in a relationship with Betsy in the first act, he's still kind of wandering the streets looking for a purpose or a goal, really. He's really more of a ticking time bomb in this movie because throughout the entire movie, he's just kind of cynically been observing the streets, almost like an omniscient presence. But then at the very end, once he's had enough of all the horrible shit that's been going on in New York, and with the politician that he's been voting for not doing much about it, he decides to take matters into his own hands and becomes the most insane, mentally deranged person in the entire film. The budget of the film was $1.3 million, which was low even for the 1970s, so a lot of scenes were shot guerrilla style, which added to the atmosphere and gave this movie a feel that you can't really find in any other movie because you're actually watching the dirty, gritty streets of New York as they were in the 70s. Anyways, Paul Schrader, the man who wrote the screenplay for Taxi Driver, was initially going through a deep depression, living out of his car, battling alcoholism, and feeling completely isolated. Not to mention, originally the film was going to be directed by Brian De Palma, but he turned it away, so it landed with Scorsese. Brian De Palma did introduce screenwriter Paul Schrader to Scorsese, and despite Scorsese being relatively unknown at the time, he still wanted to direct the movie because of the script's intensity. Last thing I want to mention is that Bernard Herrmann did the score for this movie, and he died right after finishing it. Scorsese used the score in the movie in remembrance of him and what he had left of it anyway. This wouldn't be the last time we'd hear a Bernard Herrmann score in a Scorsese movie, though. In his 1991 remake of Cape Fear, Scorsese decided to use the Bernard Herrmann score from the original to pay homage to the music cues and all that stuff, and to pay respect to how great of a composer he was and to respect his legacy. Speaking of Bernard Herrmann, the score for this movie is fucking incredible. It adds to the gritty, dirty, grimy city that's being portrayed on screen, while at the same time contradicting all of the dirt, the grit, and almost the sweat of the streets with the classical, calming jazz music from 40s and 30s noirs. Not to mention, the cinematography is also pretty damn great. Despite the fact that what you're looking at isn't so pretty, the cinematography is able to look pretty, despite the fact that it looks dark and gross and dirty for most of it. Not just that, but through the cinematography, you're able to see things from Travis's perspective. Like, notice how Travis is basically going on about his cynical, nihilistic outlook of New York, as the shot entirely takes place inside of his taxi. That shot and many others are used to highlight the taxi as a barrier for Travis and a reason why he's so detached from New York. Not just that, but the sound design, not just for the final gunfight at the last act, but also throughout the movie, is pretty damn great. In fact, the sound design makes you feel like you're in New York with all the yelling and all the loud cars and all that stuff. Last thing I want to mention is that one of my favorite shots in the entire movie is this one, where Travis is broken up with, and the camera just moves away because it would be too painful to see his face as he's being broken up with. That is a fantastic shot, honestly. The thing about Travis Bickle that makes him a fascinating character is that throughout the movie, he's really been cynically observing the city, and he hasn't really done much, but he's had this ticking time bomb inside him. And it's only until the very end, until we see him finally doing something about the awful state of the city he's in. And part of what I love about the ending is that I have two interpretations of what the ending could mean. The first one is a little more optimistic, and it's that Travis finally found a purpose, which is unfortunately driving behind a taxi. So, as long as he's driving behind a taxi, he's kind of a barrier from the outside world and from what goes on inside his taxi and his apartment. The second ending is the one where he kind of dies, and he's not sent straight to hell because he does have morality in him, but he's not sent to heaven because he murdered people along the way. So he's kind of in this weird purgatory where he's forced to drive a taxi for eternity. I know the second one might be a little more far-fetched, but I interpret that the camera leaving the room after the shootout was Travis's soul basically leaving the room. But enough about the ending. What I like so much about Travis's character is that he doesn't really have any goals or anything that stands out to him in particular, but he's not a blank slate. He has a clear personality, and he very clearly has a goal throughout the movie. It's just not as straightforward as you may think. This whole movie is pretty much Travis looking for a goal. That's why the pacing is a little slow. It's because Travis is trying to look for a goal. And the movie does not stick to one particular storyline, it kind of jumps around. And Robert De Niro plays him to perfection because he's really, really awkward. He's very darkly comedic in certain scenes. But he can also be really terrifying in a way where you feel like you can't really trust him, especially with those scenes with the gun. I think he sees himself as a standard action hero, like in those westerns or even in film noirs, but he's really just a disturbed individual who sees himself as a hero. Part of what I find so interesting about Travis Bickle is that you don't know if you're supposed to root for him or hate him throughout the movie. And that's because this movie doesn't really want you to like Travis. It wants you to understand his perspective and where he's coming from. For example, the last act isn't really him doing something good because he's a good person. It's pretty much out of frustration. And it's not just frustration at the people he calls scum, but it's also at the people who don't do anything about this. In fact, part of his justification for the shootout was the inefficiency of the politicians who are supposed to be cleaning up the streets and not letting stuff like that happen. In fact, part of the reason why Travis wanted to murder Charles Palantine was because he didn't really clean up the streets. He was kind of inefficient, and he saw Charles Palantine as just a man who took advantage of public opinion. Something else I find quite interesting about his character is his social awkwardness. It's used for humor whenever someone talks about something he doesn't understand, or when he's asked about something he doesn't understand. He usually either changes the subject entirely or defaults to, well, I don't know, I don't follow that closely, whether it be politics, movies, music. He doesn't really have a personality, and that just highlights his detachment from humanity or even the city he's living in, honestly. Like, it's very clear that Betsy and Travis have no chemistry. In fact, their first date was actually pretty awkward, and their second date was even worse. So, it's very clear these people have nothing in common, but Travis keeps telling himself that they do, and he's just an awkward person. Something else I find really interesting about Travis as a character is that the scenes with him in the porno theater is less of him trying to find any pleasure from them and more him trying to find intimacy. And the scenes where he's holding a pistol is more so there to show him slowly turning insane and slowly turning more unhinged and dangerous. All of this to say that Travis is really interesting as a character, and there's way more layers to him than you'd think. And those are the reasons why Taxi Driver is my favorite film of all time.